Thank you for listening to this talk. I'm going to be reflecting on experiences as an expert in magic. So what does it mean to be an expert when we talk about trying to do post-normal science? And in this work, I'm very much reflecting on the Hutton experiences in Magic Project, and I'll say a little bit more about our focus on that. And I'd like to also acknowledge the role and the input of our colleagues in the wider Magic Consortium. So, as you probably know if you're reading this, post-normal science highlights the need to move beyond traditional expectations of the production and use of scientific knowledge. And as part of this, acknowledging controversies, opening up problem framings is necessary and particularly important when we think about our complex sustainability challenges. But the literature is perhaps a little silent about what this actually means for being an expert and trying to implement post-normal science. So to think a little bit more about the potential roles of experts, I referred here to Esther Turnhout's typology, and so she talks about three potential ways of doing this, and of course these are kind of stereotypes to some extent. So we have the idea of a servicer. So this is somebody who is an academic expert, provides scientific usable facts to solve problems that is the domain of decision makers. So as the scientist doesn't get involved in the decisions and doesn't question the framing of a problem. So this fits very well in with the idea of the deficit model that we often see critiqued in the post-normal science literature. The second potential way of working as an expert is as an advocate. So here, the expert acknowledges and is engaged with the controversy that's associated with the problem framing, and their research is explicitly shaped by the interests and views, and their findings are explicitly connected with the recommendations. And the last potential role is that of a diversifier, that's Esther's term, or I would use the language of broker, as someone who acknowledges that there's plural problem framings and there's controversy, but who seeks to bring together different forms of knowledge, different perspectives on an issue, what the problem is, what the solutions might be, and actively participates in the process of suggesting or evaluating options. When we look at formal acknowledgement about how scientific experts and expertise are expected to behave, we see that scientific expertise is valued in public policy. We see this through intergovernmental initiatives, efforts to create scientific advisors and committees, etc. But it's often justified in this servicing term, i.e. of provision of facts for instrumental use that fits well in with the deficit model. This instrumental use is widely acknowledged officially, but the other types of use less so. So, for example, the use of knowledge to advance or oppose certain claims and projects, or the use of knowledge just to change ideas and ways of thinking. So in shorthand, modernist expectations prevail. We are not in a post-normal world, not yet. So stepping now to think a little bit about magic, and then so I think magic will have been introduced in other companion slides, which you can go and have a look at. But magic very much deals with the idea of the nexus, the water, energy, food, and environment are issues that need to be interconnected, and they're not just biophysical domains that are interconnected, but also governance domains. So the way in which we go about designing and implementing our policies really should reflect the nexus. It is a nexus in its own right. And for the parts of the project I'm going to speak of, there's a very strong policy focus of understanding policy interconnections and the implications for sustainability. The approach that magic uses to try and implement post-normal science is quantitative storytelling, or QST. So this builds on the post-normal science ethos, and it's about a multidisciplinary set of scientists working together to connect and analyse a variety of data sources. But it's more than that, it's about transdisciplinarity. So it's about engaging with stakeholders, in this case policy, to understand what the salient current issues are of concern, and to build a process that reflects on those. So identifying themes, deciding what to represent through more formal and quantitative analysis, and then presenting that back and using that as the basis of discussion. So the overall aim is to explore and prompt discussion, potentially reflection, on dominant problem framings and assumptions. It is not necessarily just or at all to fit in with this dominant idea of servicing policy by providing facts to decision makers. So when we think about what this might mean for expertise, this perhaps suggests that magic researchers should be acting in a broker role, the idea of bringing together different knowledges, rather than in that traditional servicing role. Potentially, perhaps, they're acting in the advocacy role as well. Again, as I said before, the post-normal science literature is perhaps a little silent about the implications for individual experts and how they should behave. So this is my reading of what we might expect the magic experts to do. And the presentation I'm going to focus on, the experiences of actually being an expert, is going to reflect on our work related to sustainable agriculture, with a particular focus on CAP as a focal policy. So MAGIC is planned, or QST is planned as an iterative cycle of engagement with those influencing and implementing the CAP, over the particular target of the European Commission and Parliament. So we work through this cycle. We identify key narratives or themes in CAP and connected policies, and we use document analysis and interviews to do that. We carry out quantitative analyses of aspects of these themes with the societal metabolism analysis, and we use the outputs in discussion and reflection on environmental and societal viability and the desirability of the current situation. And then this is a process that ideally should be repeated as we respond to stakeholder engagement and their views and perceptions, and that then shapes future cycles of analysis. So now I think a little bit more about our actual experiences. So this ideal cycle of repeated loops didn't quite play out as we'd hoped. First of all, we had difficulty in recruiting policy stakeholders. So we were new to working at the European scale, and we didn't have that many personal contacts, for example, in the Directorate Generals. And there was no gatekeeper to aid with recruitment, no one whose mandate it was to make the introduction for us. And the reactions when we did try to engage meant that we tended to downplay perhaps the post-normal ethos and instead emphasize relevance. So we would perhaps talk about exploring how their decision processes work at present, what problems they perceive at present, how they would like an analysis to support them in order to try and encourage their interest in our work. We also took the approach, due to problems in recruitment, of trying more passive dissemination activity just to raise a profile of the project. So this wouldn't really count as any kind of active engagement at all, but we hoped it would be the gateway to future engagement. So this is a slide to show, though, that we did succeed in engaging with stakeholders. And this is a photograph from our main event, a workshop with stakeholders mainly from the European Commission, several different directorates general. And here we presented the results of our formal analyses, the societal metabolism analysis, which we believe generally showed that European agriculture is unsustainable in several dimensions, and where we also hope to discuss this and the views and reactions of these stakeholders themselves. But the responses we received at these kind of events were challenging. They didn't always really want to discuss the issues that we wished to discuss. So they, for example, would ask questions about our terminology, would ask lots of very specific technical queries about aspects of the data that we'd used. And some, not all, would also say, but where are the very specific recommendations for current policy? So the stakeholders' own reactions were sometimes mutually contradictory. It would be hard to satisfy them all, and generally tended to leave us with little space, and there was little appetite to discuss reflection and reframing. So we sort of felt that perhaps the stakeholders were unwilling or unable to acknowledge some of the problems that we were highlighting, or the scale of the challenges, and the very need that there might be for new perspectives and approaches. However, we did build some new awareness of the nexus perspective and its implications. So we had reactions from some MEPs saying, well, that was scary. When we talked about the scale of sustainability challenges facing agri-food systems. So lastly, just to point out that we ourselves as experts were reacting in different ways to the stakeholders. So if they asked us difficult questions or critiqued our work or failed to react as we expected, some of us might ask, well, how can we better help you? Or what is it that you would like to see? And you could see that as falling more into the servicing role. Some of us, sometimes the same people, would work harder at the relationship building, so the teas and coffees, the chat, in order to foster the ability to have more difficult conversations. Perhaps we would also point to other sources of knowledge or other studies that related to our own. And also some of us, again, sometimes some of the same people or others, different people in the same meeting, we would react to criticism or doubts about our work by more strongly emphasizing our own views and saying more clearly what we felt the problems were. So this could be seen as falling more into the advocacy role. And so this is a time-consuming, headache-generating, uncomfortable process for us as experts. And a last note almost, that speaking for myself, sometimes I even found myself downplaying any academic expertise I had. And in order to build good relationships and perhaps understanding how well I understood the policy stakeholders' point of view, but perhaps this is doing a disservice to the overall transdisciplinary process because I'm downplaying some of my own skill set. So, in summary, what happened? Well, academic experts in magic adopted a variety of roles. And we can see some of this as mirroring the idea of servicing, some of it similar to the idea of acting as advocates with explicit positions, and also some elements of the brokerage. And this can be the same individuals over time or different individuals from magic reacting with each other and reacting with stakeholders. So we can think about this actually quite interestingly in relation to the ideas to demonstrate credibility, legitimacy, and relevance. So these are the kind of criteria that Cash argued are required for knowledge to be seen as usable. But I think we can also use these criteria to reflect upon ourselves and how we try to come across as experts. And of course, these criteria are evaluated in ways that don't relate to post-normal science. They really relate to a pre-existing traditional modernist understanding of how science should support policy. So, was the magic process consistent with post-normal science? Well, no, not perfectly, but it was productive. And I think we did succeed in generating some reflection and reframing, perhaps just not as much as we would have liked. And this is because pre-existing structures, processes, and individual practices, they challenge activities like QST. They don't reflect QST, and so they tend to act to oppose it. So I conclude that putting post-normal science into practice is definitely challenging, agreeing with existing work, and perhaps placing more of an emphasis on the individual perspective and the individual lived experience. And it's been acknowledged, and others will talk about the need to think about uncomfortable knowledge, but perhaps we also need to think about uncomfortable roles. And there are multiple potential tensions. We don't have time to go through them all here. But we can see between expectations, actual experiences, different experts themselves reacting off each other as well as reacting off stakeholders, and in the way we behave in different roles over time. So this is my final slide, really. So the point I want to make is that the micropolitics of participation intersect with the macropolitics of sustainability, and we can't implement more post-normal science, or we can't begin to do it better unless we think a little bit more about these micropolitics and the particularities of engagement. So with respect to recommendations or avenues for future work, we need to develop the roles of experts and expertise as being hybrid and dynamic. Consider the tension created by being hybrid. And we need to avoid inconsistency and insincerity, but that is easier said than done. And perhaps an way of doing that is to engage with the expertise and expectations of stakeholders themselves, who are not necessarily following the post-normal science ethos. As researchers, there's a need for more attention to the empirical process of engagement. These are often black-boxed, but they are complex and contested. And lastly, we need continued reflexivity, both by the experts attempting to do post-normal science and by the scholars who study them. Thank you very much. These are the references used in this talk. And lastly, here's all the many acknowledgements. And I'd like to thank also the stakeholders and the policymakers themselves who kindly participated in Magic.